Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Audrey Stewart, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to welcome you to today's Friday Forum with Juliet B. Schor discussing her latest book, After the Gig, How the Sharing Economy Got Hijacked and How to Win It Back. And she is joined today in conversation by Veena Dubal. Harvard Bookstore's Friday Forum takes place on Friday afternoons during the academic year as a way to highlight scholarly books in a wide range of fields. To learn more about Friday Forum and our many other upcoming events, our schedule appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. Today's discussion will conclude with some time for questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk today, go to the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you would like to buy a copy of After the Gig, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you, especially during this difficult time for community spaces like your local bookstore. There will also be a link for donation in the chat if you would like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Your purchases and financial contributions make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever supports the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you so much for tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these past few months, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as we can. Thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Now, I am very pleased to introduce today's speakers. Juliet Schor is a professor of sociology at Boston College. She is also a member of the MacArthur Foundation Connected Learning Research Network. She has written and edited many books on the economy and sustainability, including Sustainable Lifestyles and The Quest for Plentitude. She is a former Guggenheim Fellow and has won multiple awards for her work and research. She is joined today by Veena Dubal, who is a professor of law at the University of California, Hastings. Her work has been cited by the California Supreme Court, and her writing has been published in the LA Times, The Guardian, and Slate. She is currently working on a book. Today, they are discussing After the Gig. Based on nearly a decade of meticulous research, this new book discusses the sharing economy, what it is, what it could have been, and what it could still be. I'll leave you with this quote from Bill McKibben himself. Juliet Schor and her team have done something extraordinary. Their intensive research has let them understand what the sharing economy really feels like to its participants, and their storytelling ability lets the rest of us make complete sense of the data. In addition, they provide a workable plan for how to fulfill the promise of a gig work as part of a supportive, useful, fair economy. This book will redefine the field. And on that note of praise, I'll turn things over to our speakers. Juliet, Veena, the virtual stage is now yours.
Well, thank you so much, Audrey. It's a great pleasure to be here. I love the Friday Forum. It's a venue I've been really privileged to be at as an author and also in the audience. So fantastic to be here. Veena?
Thank you so much for having me, and I am just deeply, deeply honored to be in conversation with you, Julie. You all just heard Julie's introduction, but perhaps what was not articulated is that she is really not just a behemoth in this particular field, thinking about the sharing or gig economy, but also in thinking about work more broadly. And she has been a central both public intellectual and incredible scholar for people across disciplines in thinking about the problems with work for a very long time. She's also an amazing mentor in addition to being an amazing thinker. And I think that everyone, probably any one of your students or young mentees who are listening today can attest to that. So this is an honor. This is an amazing book. It will change the conversation, and I'm delighted to be here to talk to you about it.
Thank you, Veena. I mean, and I'm thrilled you were willing to come. I think we're in a mutual admiration society. So let me just talk for a few minutes about the book, our findings, where we ended up, and then Veena and I are going to, have a conversation. So I think it makes sense to start with the origins of the gig economy, or what's also called the sharing economy, because in those origins, I think we can see a direction for where we might go to reorient this sector, which has really gotten off track. Uber and Lyft were founded in 2008-9. Of course, it was at the height of the Great Recession, right after the financial collapse. And the sector launched with what we call in the book an idealist discourse. It promised economic, social, and environmental benefits. It had a win-win, slightly implausible win-win discourse. On the economic side, it promised efficiency, using assets that were idle a lot of the time more intensively. And that was thought to lead to environmental benefits. So if you could use spare rooms instead of hotels, you wouldn't have to build as many hotels. If people could share cars, a lot of people would think they wouldn't need to buy cars. So those were the sort of twin ideas of efficiency and emissions, really, reduced emissions. It also promised opportunity for people. We were in the midst of a terrible unemployment crisis, as we are today. The platforms were places people could easily hop onto to earn extra money, to maybe be able to stay in their house, pay down their student debt. And these are the kinds of things we found when we interviewed people. And then there was a social promise about connection, that because these platforms were hosting what I've called stranger sharing, or person-to-person interactions, it was thought that they were going to make durable ties. So you hop in a Lyft, you give the fist bump to the driver, you start talking, you find you have a connection. You host someone on Airbnb or couch surfing in your home, you become friends. So all of those things were promised. And one thing that I think hasn't been recognized enough is the extent to which the idealist discourse grew out of longer standing traditions within Silicon Valley. And when we look at those traditions, we can see the two possible paths that the sharing economy might have taken. One is what's been called cyber utopianism, which is the idea that online connections and online communities lead to egalitarian outcomes. They bring people together in non-hierarchical kind of flat spaces. They bypass established structures of power. And this was a really prominent idea in Silicon Valley in its early days, but it has continued through. There's a thread line that gets us to sharing economy platforms, sort of more prominently or obviously to the nonprofit platforms that were also founded at this time. And those are important. I mean, couch surfing started as a nonprofit. You don't pay money. Repair cafes, tool libraries, time banks, maker spaces. But also some of the for-profits use this same sort of cyber utopian discourse. But there was another strand within Silicon Valley, which was what we might think of as free market tech, which is the idea that the government is bad, the corporations are good, the corporations are going to get us all this good stuff. Unfettered corporations bring freedom, prosperity, liberty. And that, of course, is the Uber philosophy. So there was a sort of right-wing Silicon Valley discourse and a more left-wing one. And you could see both of them in the so-called sharing economy. Now, I just mentioned the nonprofits. They have been important. They were important in the founding of the sector. They remain quite important in other parts of the world, Europe especially. And they were part of the early community. And that's actually where my research team started. Because in 2008-9, when I first started thinking about these issues, there was a lot of hope for things like maker spaces and time banks and food swaps and repair cafes, sort of true sharing initiatives at the community level that were really going to help people who were in economic distress, or were going to build a different kind of egalitarian economy. So we began, I assembled a team, and I just want a shout out. I don't know if any of the team members are here. I wrote this book with a team of people who were all PhD students in sociology at the time. They've now pretty much almost all of them have graduated. We did 13 case studies of different sharing initiatives, both these nonprofits, which is the kinds of nonprofits that I just mentioned, and then we turned our attention to the for-profits like Airbnb, TaskRabbit. We did a lot of work with TaskRabbit, Turo, which is Airbnb for cars, delivery platforms, Postmates and Favor, Uber, Lyft, of course, and we ended with a platform cooperative owned by the workers. I'm still working on these issues. That team went for almost 10 years. I'm still working on these issues with a group of colleagues from Northeastern and also some BC PhD students. And we're looking at Instacart, Prime Shoppers, and a number of delivery apps. So we can also talk about what's happened since the book came out. And if you are from the team and you're here, let us know in the Q&A. So things haven't turned out as expected, and the subtitle of the book is How the Sharing Economy Got Hijacked. And I guess the question, that I want to address is why? What happened? So let me just say a word about the nonprofits. And I wasn't planning to talk too much about them today. Happy to go into it in the Q&A. I think they're a really interesting story. The nonprofits we studied are in the Boston area. So to the extent that this is a Boston area audience, if folks are interested in these, I will, we can go into detail. We studied a makerspace, a food swap, and a time bank in this locale. And I guess the sort of easiest way to talk about what happened with these nonprofits would be the term failure to thrive. So one of them actually failed during the time we were studying it. One of them thrived in a lot of ways, but not in others. But in all of these cases, there were kind of what we might think of as dynamics of social exclusion that really undermined the missions and the intentions of the founders and the participants and so forth. And I think they hold some important lessons for those of us who are trying to build alternative economies, and I put myself in that camp. But what about the for-profits? I mean, they comprise many, many more people, have gotten a lot of attention. So we began studying these in pretty much in the early days. And I would say that in the early days, things were pretty good on a lot of these platforms. The earners were generally happy, although then, as now, and of course it's gotten much worse, but making a full-time living on these platforms was hard to do even in the early days. And that was true for a couple of reasons. Either the wages were too low. So in the very earliest days, wages were good on all of these platforms. They were a lot more than minimum wages. They were a lot more than people could get from many of the kinds of skills that they were engaged in on the platforms. But even on the really high wage platforms, so TaskRabbit, as I mentioned, we studied a lot. It's a general kind of errands and work platform, both in the home and out. Some of the big tasks on TaskRabbit were putting together IKEA furniture, delivery, house cleaning is a big one, but also some virtual tasks and so forth. TaskRabbit tends to have really high wages, far above minimum wage, and also has a really highly educated workforce. But it's hard to get enough work on TaskRabbit to have a decent income. And one of the things we found was what we call dependent earners, people who were dependent on the platforms to pay their basic expenses for their rent, their food, car payments, etc. People who were dependent workers generally earned up to or below the poverty line. It was very, very hard to get out of poverty as a dependent worker. Now, of course, some people could, but in general, that's what we found. Whereas what we called supplemental workers, people who are adding on this gig work to other sources of income, in most cases, a full-time job. Maybe they're students, so they don't need to earn a full income, or possibly a spousal income or so forth. Those folks had really positive experiences. They got higher wages because they could discriminate more in the tasks they took. They had a lot more flexibility in their schedule because they didn't just have to work when the market demand was there. And on many of these gigs, market demand is very variable over the day and even over the week. They also had a lot more autonomy in how they did the work, much less worried about their ratings and reputations, deactivation, and so forth. As you know, one person said to us when we asked, well, what would happen if your rating went down and the platform asked you to do another orientation? And they were like, no way. They just wouldn't do it anymore. It was interesting the extent to which the supplemental workers did things in the way they wanted rather than the way the platform wanted. So one of the big issues in the scholarship and also in the public discussions about platforms is sort of how much autonomy do workers really have? How much algorithmic control are the platforms exercising? And we found big differences between the dependent workers, or what you might think of as the full-time workers, although it's not exactly the same thing, and the supplementals. And one of the important things is that over time, more and more workers on these platforms, especially the low-wage platforms, ride-hailing and delivery, were dependent workers. It came to be a more and more dependent workforce. And that's part of why things have gone south on the for-profits, to use that, think of it in that way. So why did they go south? So in some ways, the model never made a lot of sense for some platforms. So if you take Uber, the biggest of all the platforms, has the most workers. Uber priced its rides far below cost. And what that meant was that they were always losing money. They were always pressuring the drivers. They were only going to be able to have a viable model if they could absolutely come to dominate the market, wipe out all the competition, and raise the prices high enough so that they could make a profit on each ride. Well, that's turned out to be a lot more difficult than they expected. And the hype about Uber said, the low prices are a big part of what drove consumers to the services, but they're not sustainable on a lot of these apps, certainly not on ride hail. To a certain extent, I think also not sustainable at current levels on delivery, and to some extent on some of the tasks. So these platforms are depending on the exploitation of the workers and the failure to obey employment law. This has been a specialty. We're going to talk about that when I finish in a minute. But what that sort of bad model to begin with meant was eventually a lot of pressure from investors, because there's a point at which they want to see profitability. And that's been important in the downward trajectory of wages, which you have seen on ride hail, you've seen on delivery. If you look at a high wage platform like TaskRabbit, I think what's happened is the opposite, which is the wages are high, but that restricts the demand. And that's the basic, there's a kind of basic contradiction there, or a basic sign of economic conflict there. It's a very simple, obvious thing. You lower the prices, you get more customers, but you have to squeeze the workers. You raise the prices, you have a smaller market. And would Uber be profitable at a small fraction of its size? That's the question. They don't want to find out. They want to wipe out public transportation. They want to wipe out Lyft. They want to wipe everybody out, dominate the market, and then they can exploit not just the workers, but the customers too. Okay, lots more to say on that. But let me just end with the question of what's possible. What could we do? Can we get this sharing economy back on track? And do we even want to? There are plenty of people who think gigs are terrible. We want to move to a full-time, secure employment system. And, this whole experiment in gig economy should be stopped. So, one of the things to recognize about platforms is that they're very different than conventional businesses. They generally operate with open access for earners and obviously for consumers too. What that means is almost anybody can join the platforms. There are a few qualifications around background checks and so forth. But for the most part, these are really easy apps to get on and to try and earn on. Now, one of the things that does is it gives chronic excess supply, particularly when there's a bad labor market. And that's what we saw. That's what we're seeing right now in the post-COVID environment, which is tons of people streaming onto these apps, getting harder and harder for people to make money. And so when the larger labor market is doing bad, more people go onto apps. And you can see that in the data as the general unemployment rate moves, app participation moves, and you can also see there's lots of entry and exit on these apps over the course of a year. Very, very flexible. And you can see it in the rising number of dependent workers on the lower paid on ride hail and delivery. But the openness of the apps and the flexibility of the apps actually also attracts a lot of people for whom that flexibility is essential. They may be people who have other responsibilities. We have people that we interviewed who had to leave full-time jobs because one woman got a divorce and had to take care of her children at hours that conform to the school day. And so she started working on multiple platforms as a way of doing that. Catherine Hill's done really interesting work on disabled workers and their use of the apps, because if you have many kinds of disabilities, you don't know when you're going to be able to work, what it's going to be like today, or even hour to hour, and the apps allow that. So that's one thing about the apps that's really positive, that flexibility. And the second thing about them, and this really gets us to the last point about platform co-ops owned by workers, is that the technology of the apps obviates or sort of eliminates a lot of management functions. So HR, quality control, matching consumers with earners, many of these things are done by algorithms. And so, you probably, if you've looked at this sector at all, you know that these companies, particularly in the early days, didn't hire many people at their corporate headquarters. They're very, very lean in that way. It's a big complaint of workers, drivers, especially delivery workers. But the point is that a lot of the functions of management are now automated. They are done through algorithmic management. And that means that workers don't really need that much managerial supervision. They don't need managers nearly as much as they did. And this becomes an argument for why the cooperative structure, which is owned by the workers, is so much more efficient than in these kinds of platforms. They also scale really rapidly. If you get the right technology, you can build out a workers co-op, and you get the right rules and governance, you can build out a workers co-op really quickly. So the workers co-op turns out to be a really efficient way to organize platforms. And that's why our last case, as I mentioned, was a workers cooperative. It was a photographers cooperative. Very, very successful case in which the photographers owned and governed the platform. They got much more of the money back from the photographs that they sold, and were really happy about the whole enterprise. So I think that is one possible future for the gig economy that would solve a lot of the problems of the corporate-owned platforms, and could really make it work for workers in ways that does take advantage of what this technology has to offer. So let me stop there, and I'm going to turn it over to Veena.
Thank you so much, Julie. Again, this book is really fascinating. I read it. I read the first draft, and then I read the latest, the finished product, and it's just incredibly insightful. I wonder, something that you didn't get a chance to sort of reflect on in our short time, but I want to hear you talk more about, and I think the audience probably wants to hear you talk more about also. In many ways, this research project walked the walk. I mean, this was a collaborative research project across, with many students. This book, it was, collaboratively written, and looked at not just sort of the prototypical platform capitalists. You weren't just talking to Uber drivers. You're also really talking to people in, in the post-recession and shadows of the Great Recession, who are really trying to reimagine their worlds. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about those folks and where what their trajectory was. And then I want to talk about the current moment and how we can use this current recession that we're in maybe differently than those folks did, and how to learn from sort of the mistakes of that moment.
Yeah. Okay, so let me just start with the research process and the team process, which you raised, and it really was a privilege, and it was a really wonderful experience. And I do want to thank the MacArthur Foundation, who funded the research, and they funded it in the most wonderful way, because basically, rather than the typical process of having to write a grant that says you're going to do this and then you have to do what you said, they gave us money and pretty much allowed us to go where the research took us. So we were constantly evolving, and that was wonderful. And Veena, you gave me a comment on the early version of the book, which was something I kind of hadn't realized, but basically what we were able to do, because we started when the sector was just beginning, we were kind of able to take a trip through. We sort of moved with the sector, and that was really a privilege, because it meant as things started happening, we could just follow them, and we weren't stuck with something that we had designed in year one that really wasn't as interesting in year 3 or 4, having done this over, quite a few years. So we also started out, I talk in the book about the idealist discourse. We were also an idealist team, in the sense that we had hopes. We had high hopes for many of these things that were beginning at the beginning. And so we were really interested in them because we thought they could make meaningful change and solve the problems that were so obvious in the dysfunctionality of global capitalism, in the period 2008. I mean, still, but, it was so, things had really crashed at that time. Even if we ended up becoming, I don't want to say disillusioned, we're not disillusioned, but if we saw, our research led us to see many of the problems and things going in directions that we would not have hoped they would. And the second part of your question, is really interesting, about the people that we talked to at the beginning. And one thing that was interesting was, in the early days, on both the for-profits and the nonprofits, people were really believing in that idealist discourse. People were, going on Turo, the Airbnb for cars, in order to rent out environmentally efficient cars, like hybrids. They wanted to teach other people about hybrids, or they were, making friends on Airbnb. They were trying to create a different kind of economy. So people believed that these platforms would create a person-to-person economy that was substantially different from what they saw as the dehumanizing, depersonalized, or impersonal corporate economy. And so whether it was the economic benefits, the social, or the environmental, there were a lot of true believers in those early days across the whole range of sharing economy apps.
So we have an interesting question from the audience that dovetails into one of my questions. So in your last chapter, you talk about how scholars really think about where we go from here in three ways. There's either the platform capitalists way, we sort of enshrine their model into law and regulation and just live with it. There's the state regulation way, and then there is the democratic sharing way, the true cooperative way. And in some ways, we're kind of in all of these places at the same time right now, although I think we are in a particular moment where things are shifting. And so John Marshall asks, whether you could comment on public municipal ownership of platform businesses like rideshare, and maybe also talk to us a little bit more about what that might look like in comparison to co-op models. What are sort of the possibilities in this realm, and what are the things we need to do to make one or either of those things possible?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one that really hasn't been talked about enough. Let me just say a word or two about the three paths that I talk about in the last chapter that you raised. The first one, which is the sort of just, corporate dominant platforms. One of my co-authors and friends, a Dutch scholar named Koen Franken, wrote a really interesting piece in which he made the point, and of course it's obvious now, we can see it with what's happening with Uber, is that the likely trajectory, if we just kind of let the platforms do what they want, the big corporate ones, is there'll be a couple of super platforms that sort of have all the different services, and they will come to dominate. Coke and Pepsi, Uber, Lyft. It just, that sort of model in which in so many industries, we really basically have 2 to 3 dominant firms. So that's one direction. The second is regulation, which you mentioned, and of course, Veena's worked so much on employment misclassification in the gig economy, and we've seen real change in this. What I argue in the book is beginning in 2018, you start to see the tide turning on regulation. Until that point, it had been very, very hard to get any regulation through. And in fact, most of the regulation that was happening was in the direction of more leeway and freedom for the companies. So Airbnb regulation, Airbnb was illegal in many, many places where it was operating at really high levels, and the company got legislators and regulators to change those laws to make it legal. But starting in 2018, regulators in some of the biggest cities start to clamp down in ride hail, a little bit less in delivery, and on short-term rentals, Airbnb and a few of their smaller competitors. So you see it in New York, where ride-hail drivers get a minimum wage and you get a vehicle cap. You see it in San Francisco, which really cracks down on Airbnb, LA, Boston, Seattle now considering serious ride-hail legislation. And I now have one of the collaborators on the book, Mehmet Jansoy, and I now have a database of Airbnb regulations in the 10 biggest cities. And there's just been a tremendous change, momentum really going in the regulatory dimension since 2018. And we'll talk about California, what's going on there now, but whether or not whether things have, that momentum is going to be stopped in November, or whether, what's going to happen. So that's one way. And I think it's essential. There's no question that these platforms need to obey the laws that we have, and we need to create some new laws and regulations for the new kinds of problems that they've created. But the question is sort of, do we stop there? And especially in the United States, can we do enough with regulation where we have a state that is so captured by industry, by business, and that gets us to the third path, which is we talked about the worker co-ops, what's called platform cooperativism. and the questioner's possibility, which is municipally owned municipally owned platforms. So municipally owned platforms, I think, do provide some really interesting opportunities. So there are pros and cons for the worker co-op model versus the municipal owned. With the worker co-op, I think the democratic control is a little bit easier. Where you have a municipally owned co-op, you get, in theory, you can have the democratic control, but you always have, to make the Weberian point, you have the state and its own interests coming in there, and will it really be run in the interests of the workers or the citizens, the consumers? So you'll with a municipal co-op, you'll get a ideally you'd have a multi-stakeholder. You might probably want to set it up as a more independent kind of entity so that it doesn't just get used for political reasons. So it has a sort of integrity, a governance integrity. The worker co-op model, you're a little bit more subject to the vagaries of the market, where particularly with a municipal model, the city, these would probably be run at a city level, which a lot of we studied these consumer services, most of which are face-to-face. So it tends to be local markets. There are other kinds of platforms which are global. Obviously, Airbnb has a global dimension, but digital labor, for example, Mechanical Turk and so forth, where you're calling on a global labor force, those present some other things. If we focus on the services, consumer services, where you have a municipal entity, it can do more to shape the market. And then you have the question of, is it going to be the only actor in the market? Is it going to be competing against private and so forth? I'll stop on this in a minute, but I will just mention one thing that happened while I was doing the research, and I was approached by someone who was setting up a municipal labor market in a city in Britain at a time of really high unemployment. And it was going to be a general services labor market. So consumers would go, whatever they needed, they'd post it, and anybody could come on to try and get those jobs. And it failed almost instantly because there was such a big imbalance of supply and demand. Many, many more people needed the work than there was work available. And this is also that with the worker co-ops, they have an easier time because unlike the most of the platforms, they tend not to be open access. So they are membership models. So they restrict the number of workers who can be on the platform at any one time. They try and basically match supply to demand, and there's good arguments for why you would want to do that, because otherwise it becomes can become really hard for people to make money on the platforms. So I think both models are interesting. I would like to see I'd like to see some municipal, some experimentation with municipal models. Now that we have a decade of experience with platforms, I know San Francisco is actually thinking about one in the delivery sector.
Yeah.
At a pretty serious way, I think. Veena, you probably know more about that.
Not very much, actually.
Oh.
But Julie, I wonder, you mentioned this in Great Britain, where they were considering a publicly owned platform. Katie Wells is in the audience. Hi, Katie, and she has a really great question that that I think you do such a good job of thinking about, because you've been so prolific in terms of meeting and speaking to and really understanding how the platform economy has rolled out in different places. And she's wondering if you could talk a little bit about how what you found in the US sits alongside the platform economy in other countries, and whether they connect or diverge with studies elsewhere.
Yeah, so there's tremendous variation in how the platforms operate across countries. In Europe, many of them are highly regulated. So when Uber came into Sweden, it basically had to operate just like a regular taxi service. It had to pay minimum wages and taxes and so forth. So in the countries of Europe where the labor markets, labor unions are, and labor is stronger, the platforms have to do more to treat workers better. On the other hand, there's wonderful work being done in global South contexts. A colleague named Jason Jackson at MIT is studying ride hail in many global South cities and finding levels of exploitation and abuse through subcontracting, through predatory loans, kind of all the, familiar tactics of labor exploitation that we're seeing there. So it is very contextual. Uber's been banned in a number of European countries, for example, because it won't follow the rules. Veena, can I ask you a question which relates to one of the ones in the chat? Just, because I really want to make sure we have enough time to talk about what's going on in California and misclassification. Vanessa says, I'm a freelance professional. Many of my colleagues are concerned about regulations that go too far in forcing companies to treat us as employees. And Veena's done pioneering work on what led so many ride-hail drivers to support the California law that reclassified that, or that made sure they were classified as employees. And yeah, what do you think? What do you think about
it's a
question?
It's a really hard question, and I see some of you might know I've become a target of harassment as a result of a lot of misinformation about what's been going on in California and my relationship to it. And I see some of the Uber PR people in our attendee list, so they're here and listening and curious to hear what we have to say. I think that part of the reason, and Ben asked this question, why is there so much attention being paid to the issue of worker classification here? So in the United States, as you all know, the main pathway to security, because we do not have another kind of social safety net in the way that they do in Northern Europe in particular, is through employment. So the only way that you get healthcare, unless you're paying for it yourself, the only way that you get access to unemployment insurance, to workers' compensation if you're injured on the job, all of these safety nets that we all really need is through employee status. But that makes employment really expensive. And so the reason that these platform companies came in and just really capitalized off of these carve-outs in the law and tried to widen them, tried to make it seem like their workers were actually independent contractors, was because it was so much cheaper for them. So it was easy for them to scale, and easier for them to keep labor costs down. But unlike true independent contractors, like people who are in worker cooperatives, for example, who are really determining their own fares or their own prices, who are really building client lists, who are hustling to be, small business owners. Workers in these economies are highly controlled through the business model and through algorithms. This is not true across the platform economy, but it is particularly true in the U.S. for the platform companies that get the most attention and that employ the most workers. And so I think, Ben, as to your question, that is why there is so much attention being played to the issue of worker classification when we think about regulating the platform economy more broadly. And my sense is that regulators see this as the most, as the biggest pressure point for these companies, that what they're hearing from their constituents is that people are not earning a minimum wage, that they're sleeping in their cars, that, in California, that economic inequality is being exacerbated by this work as opposed to being ameliorated by this work. And there's the sense, I think, that we still have in the United States that if you work 10 to 12 hours a day, you should be able to put food on the table and pay your rent. And so there's some real, I think, conflict between the innovation and promise that Julie talks about in her book and that she talked about today, that was sort of promised at the beginning. In the shadows of Occupy, people wanted real freedom, real flexibility, real hope for true ownership of their labor, of their work, of their everyday lives, and then what these platforms actually ended up offering in real time. So in my work, I see a trajectory, a shift in how people doing this work for these companies felt about the work itself. So one of the things that I've written a lot about is how taxi workers actually across the board were pretty happy as independent contractors for much of the 90s and early 2000s. And part of the reason that was because they were arguably true independent contractors. They could build their own client lists. They could, in many cases, they could sort of stop and start when they wanted to. They could work when they wanted to, but also because they were working in a highly regulated environment in which fares were regulated. Their safety issues were regulated. They were in many places getting workers' comp and unemployment insurance, and so they were getting sort of the best of both worlds, in that they had the safety net and the independence. And because of fare regulation, because of supply regulation, they were also able to feel like they were independent and real small business people. And workers in this economy do not feel that way. And it's really shifted, and it's shifted over the past 8 years as fares have, as commissions have dropped, as workers realize that that they're being controlled by the algorithms, that they're working much longer hours to make the same amount of money, and that is the existing pressure point that we have in the laws to, employment status to sort of address these issues. In California, that led the California Supreme Court to looking at an offline delivery company to adopt this ABC test, which essentially says, for those of you who aren't familiar, that there is a presumption of employment, and if a hiring entity wants to treat their workers like independent contractors, that they have to fulfill 3-part test. And if the hiring entity is doing the exact same work as the workers themselves, if Uber is a transportation company and the workers are transportation workers, then there can't be any kind of, those workers cannot be employees, independent contractors under state law. And then that was later codified and applied to all California law under AB 5. And there is a lot of consternation about this, because while this test really attempts to capture the issues that industry has caused, all of this massive misclassification of people who are very clearly employees. Because we live in a national and international economy, it has meant that some more unscrupulous businesses have been able to take, particularly in certain industries, be able to take their work and put that work elsewhere. And so, one of the ways to address this is, of course, to nationalize the ABC test, so that, you can't just move, if you don't want to use a writer in California because he's too expensive, move to Nevada where he's cheaper. But I think the other way, and I think this is really important and brings us back to Julie's work, is to start thinking about how we make platform cooperatives or cooperatives more broadly, a real part of our economy. What are the necessary regulations that need to be passed to facilitate this? What are the barriers to creating cooperatives, and what kind of real innovation, whether technological innovation or regulatory innovation, can we push ourselves towards to enable this? And Julie studied Stocksy. In your last chapter, you talk a lot about this Stocksy platform cooperative and the possibilities and failures. And I wonder, Julie, turning it back to you, if you could talk more about that. Like, what do we need to do to make this possible, to recapture the gig, to give people the freedom and that they want the feeling of not being a boss, the feeling of self-ownership, and simultaneously offering them creating ways to have real safety net protections.
Yeah. So
solve all of our problems for us in the next 7 minutes.
No, but I also, there's one other thing I want to say about the employment classification. But let me just finish, we'll finish that conversation and then I'll talk about Stocksy for a minute. I've had the privilege of being able to study a company that switched all of its California workers. It's a platform company switched all of its California workers to employees in anticipation of AB5. And I've been able to, in this new project I'm doing, we've talked to both the workers and we've also talked with managers. And what's been really interesting is, and this very much validates a point that Veena's made quite a few times, these workers retained a lot of flexibility under employment status. The companies say they will necessarily lose flexibility. There's nothing in the law that says that has to happen. And this company actually was able to maintain a high, not maybe absolutely as much, but a really high level. Number one, the managers we talked to have basically said they prefer this model. There are fewer problems, the efficiency is higher, the productivity is higher. The rub on it is that it's more expensive. And so this is, the biggest reason why the companies don't want to do it. But I think what we can say from that is that we don't want businesses that can only exist by exploiting people or basically doing what's predatory pricing, which is pricing below really what a service should cost. So consumers may not love it because the ride hails will become more expensive. But the idea that you should have really cheap private cars at your disposal at any time it's not only sort of ecologically a disaster, but it also really undermines the public transportation system, which is what we need is a public transportation system that basically meets people's needs, and going in those private cars is something that's more of an occasional occurrence rather than every day I can get to wherever I need to go by having a private driver. Okay, so Stocksy and the platform co-ops. I think that, one of the things about the cooperative model in these kinds of contexts is that these are almost all individual contribution kinds of activities. So a driver, a house cleaner, a freelancer of many types. There's a wonderful co-op in Europe called SMART. It has more than 35,000 members. It operates in over 40 countries. It's all types of freelancers, whether it's graphic design, copy editing, you name it, coding. So those are individual contributions. And so people get paid for what they do, unlike a plywood cooperative or, an auto factory that goes cooperative where people are making a common product. And one of the things this means is that the revenue distribution is going to be very different than in those. In the co-op we studied, a small number of people earn a lot, a high fraction. They also invest a lot more in what they're doing, and they're like the dependent workers. They're the really full timers. And then you have a lot of people who kind of pop in and out and have a much more tenuous relationship to it. So that's one of the things that's different about a platform cooperative than a sort of old-fashioned workers cooperative.
I wonder, Julie, if you could, I don't know if you have thought about, I know you've thought about this, but I can't remember whether you talk about this in your book, but in the platform context, if we're talking about it in the US, unless those workers are considered employees of the platforms, they're going to have the same sorts of precarious problems with regard to injury on the job or unemployment insurance if the platform folds. And so I wonder the extent to which you think that employment status and platforms are sort of mutually beneficial or possible sort of to exist simultaneously, or the other sort of option or conversation that we never have in the U.S., or at least not in real in policy circles where we're actually making policy, is how do we disentangle the employment from the safety net and make it possible to for people to really be freelancers, or really be small business people, or be members of a cooperative and still lead secure lives.
This is so important. I mean, I think that tying everything to employment status historically has been very I mean, it did a lot of wonderful things, but it also has had a lot of unintended impacts. So for example, people having to stay in jobs for health insurance. The connection between health insurance and employment, I think, is a disaster. And it's really important to an issue that I've studied for most of my career, which is working hours. It's a big part of why working hours are so high in this country, because if an employer gives health insurance to someone, they want them to work long hours. They don't want to have to hire many more people and pay their benefits. So the more we can de-link safety net dimensions from employment, the better. I mean, that's one of the great things about universal basic income. And so the vision that I had, in Plenitude, my previous book, and in this one, is sort of thinking about ways that make it possible for people to live without that dependence on the employer to get their basic needs. And so whether it's providing more at the municipal level, providing it at the federal level, I mean, there are many ways to do this. But I do think that, especially in a world where employment is becoming less and less secure, where AI is going to eliminate a lot of jobs, where we need to power down our economy, not kind of rev it up. For ecological reasons, people working less is a lot better, kind of de-escalate. All of those things suggest the more we can do outside of employment, the better. And that then opens up a lot more space for people to be active in these flexible ways on these gig platforms, in ways that meet their needs and that are not sort of oppressive, and they have to do it because otherwise, if they get sick, they don't have a way to be taken care of, or so forth. So yes, I definitely think that's the way to go.
So Julie, we have 2 more minutes, and I want to just say one more thing about your book, and then I want to give you the floor to end. I want to encourage all of those of you in the audience who haven't already purchased a book to purchase it, or get it from your library, or buy it for your library, or buy it for your school, because I think what it does is, in a very accessible way, talks to an audience about how we got to this conversation and why we're so fixated on it. Why the platform economy, despite the fact that it's such a small percentage of the economy in the United States, at least, why we talk so much about it, why it has touched so many different people's lives, what the promises were, and why those promises have more or less, for the most part, not been met, and how I think from the voices of the people who have experienced it, how in many ways they've reproduced the same inequalities that they were attempting to solve or to move past. And the fact that you have, this is very rare for a social science book, for a sociology book, the fact that you have answers for us, you have examples and visions for how to move forward, I think is so incredibly hopeful and promising. And so not just for academics, not just for policymakers, but for people, everyday people who are living their lives, I think this book has a lot to offer. And I thank you so much for your decade of research and leadership and collaboration, and the culmination of all of that, which is this really very wise, very groundbreaking, and very important book.
Thank you, Veena. Thank you so much. I want to spend my last minute answering the question about what should a DSA chapter in a blue state do to emulate California's AB5. Get in touch with progressive legislators and progressive unions, and they will They will help that. We already have an effort here in Massachusetts from our Attorney General to go this. And I think we probably need to turn it over to Audrey to end.
Well, thank you both for being here. This was so much fun. I think the work you're doing is so incredibly important, and I appreciate that both of you continuing to work and continuing to seek these improvements in our country, and especially all the work you're doing for workers. And thank you again for taking the time to be here today and talk to us, talk with Harvard Bookstore. And thank you to everyone at home showing up and watching today. Thanks for tuning in, for authors, publishers, indie book selling, and the incredible staff at Harvard Bookstore. If you'd like to support Julia in the bookstore, you can purchase a copy of After the Gig. There's a link in the chat. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Thank you again. Be well, everybody. Have a good day.